Hello, listeners. Welcome to the Race to a Cure podcast. My name is Ria, and I'll be your host for today. Joining me is Roberto Babaran Jr., a third-year honors bachelor's of accounting and financial management student at the University of Waterloo. For those of you who don't know much about Race to a Cure, we are a national platform striving to create opportunities that empower youth interested in science, technology, engineering, arts, and math through comprehensive research, civic improvement, and social welfare. We have many ongoing projects, such as this podcast, and we also publish articles and studies on our website, racetoacure.org. So be sure to check those out. Also, make sure to follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Race to a Cure to get updates for articles and events. But today is not about me or R2AC, it's about RJ. So would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, 100%. So my name's RJ. I'm currently in my third year in the accounting and finance program at Waterloo, like you mentioned. And I guess something pretty interesting about my background is my parents actually met in university studying debits and credits together. So you could say that I was sort of destined growing up to become an accountant. But I guess that's sort of part of my background, and that's always been like that business mindset and that interest in that field has always been part of me. So yeah, happy to be here and would love to sort of share my story and learn more about you guys.
That's a really cute story of how your parents met. It's almost like from the beginning they knew that this relationship, like now our kid's going to go into that. That must be a really nice journey for you. So you have a really
Mhm.
interesting educational pathway, and you're exploring a field that personally I think is pretty interesting, and I hope our listeners do too. So I guess first let's talk a bit about your university experience. So you said that you're studying accounting at Waterloo and financial management. So coming from a high schooler like
Mhm.
myself, finance is like not exactly taught in schools as thoroughly as some other subjects like science might be. So personally in Ontario, we have like business and accounting courses you can take, but these are often like electives and they might not always be enough to spark interest in a field. So I know you said maybe your parents have been in the field, so you've got exposure that way. But when did you decide that accounting was your passion for studying?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first piece to it is definitely grew up in that environment where I think that focus on a financial mindset was always sort of emphasized growing up. But I think for me, the real spark of interest in business and accounting specifically came in I think it was grade 10. I remember there's this program, this entrepreneurship program that I got involved with called Junior Achievement. I think it's sort of this international nonprofit that enables high school students to meet other like-minded high school students and start this sort of small business. And the cool part about the program is it's about an 18-week program, and you get to see all different aspects of the startup process, from ideating the product to actually putting together the production process behind it, and then finally overseeing the sales and marketing process with the go-to-market piece of that business. And so I think that was really how my interest in business was sparked. And then I think the second part to that, sort of touching on that element that you mentioned about business not being as covered as maybe say the sciences, is at least in the Ontario high schools that I'm familiar with, the CPA sort of designation is something that is really heavily emphasized within a lot of high schools. And so that would have been the second piece. And it was sort of the mixture of the two that sparked that interest in accounting.
That's really interesting. I've heard of those JA startups where like there's youth just like me and Thomas or you like who can just start up a business and have it actually grow quite a bit. So what was your business that you started up?
Yeah, so I was actually a part of the program for a couple of years. So there were actually a couple sort of embedded in there. But I think one of the favorites that I remember was this company called Ticlo. And so what we essentially noticed is that there were a lot of different fabrics, let's call them like jeans or maybe different fabrics from around the house that a lot of people sort of were throwing out. And this whole idea of textile waste was a huge thing back then. And what we wanted to do was we wanted to find a way to solve that in a sort of social enterprise approach. And
Hmm.
so we were taking some of these fabrics from families that we knew, and we were sort of repurposing them and creating them into these sort of pillow products. And so we would sell these pillows to different sort of people that we knew, and I think that was something that I sort of enjoyed.
That's really interesting. So not only is it good for the environment, but it also teaches you a lot about the business side of things. That's really fascinating. So
Yeah.
obviously in high school you were able to be inspired by these things, and now that you're in Waterloo, as your experience as a university student, have you done any, I don't know, volunteering or co-op or work in the field of finance that has also helped enhance your understanding of the field?
Yeah, I definitely have. I think something that I've always loved about my background is even though I'm studying accounting and finance, I've always found a way to integrate that element of entrepreneurship and growth stage uh, firms within my own story. So I think
Hmm.
more recently, the most recent internship that I was working at was a sort of venture capital growth equity role. And so I don't know if I guess the listeners are familiar with something like Dragon's Den or Shark Tank. You could imagine sort of it was quite a similar environment, except instead of sort of smaller firms that maybe have a couple members on the team, it tended to be more of a focus on uh, technology, larger scale firms across North America. And so I think, yeah, that sort of outlines one of the experiences I've had within the financial industry. And yeah, I guess the idea behind it is you find really promising startups or growing companies and you give them money and take some of their firm, a percentage, let's say, to sort of compensate for that. So that's a little bit about that, and would be happy to share a little bit more if there anything specific.
Yeah, no, that sounds really interesting. I remember recently watching an episode of Canada's like CBC Dragon's Den, and it was fascinating, like the way they approach these different businesses and their business models and like how much money they make, and then they decide like whether to invest or not. And I think being in that environment, it really gives you like a real world feel. So how was that in terms of like studying accounting and finance versus seeing it being applied in the business world? How did that affect your understanding of the field?
Yeah, so that's a that one sort of I would say it's a multi-part answer. I think I would just emphasize like the most important realization that I had personally was the the realization that a lot of the learning that comes with like careers in business, let's say, it doesn't really come from the textbook or like the academic setting, although that sets the foundation and precedent for these eventual internships. But most of the learnings actually come from being in that, like you mentioned, that whole being in the mix, let's call it, and actually getting a chance to evaluate different companies, see what you like, see what you dislike, like use different frameworks to approach that analysis, and then figure out whether it's a business that you'd want to invest in. So I think it's really helped to enhance my understanding because I've had the chance to bring that into different club environments and academics that I eventually took on afterward and apply some of those ideas and approaches to evaluating companies in my academics.
Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense. That real world like interaction, that experience can really enhance everything. And like you said, you can always bring it back to school or back to clubs. Now, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, most students are learning from home, doing university from home. It's everything's become digital. And it's been like that for almost a year now. So how has the virtual university experience been for you? I don't know if you've had some internships online or some other experiences, extracurriculars online, but in comparison to your previous in-person years, how has the past year been?
Mm-hmm. I think it's definitely been a mix of like good and bad. I think obviously you guys have probably experienced the same for yourself. It's sort of a double-edged sword there. I think I tend to prefer focusing on the positive, but I think one of the things that I've really loved about it is in some ways like there's a flow, a sense of flow and routine that I've gotten familiar with and in some senses embraced because I think when it comes to like having dinner with the family or going on walks with sort of my sister or my dad, I think I've sort of enjoyed that whole process and built like that daily habit sort of thing. And then
Yep.
obviously studying and interacting over Zoom with different clubs that I'm involved with. I think there's definitely been some things that I've liked.
That's good. That's good to focus on the positive. I'm sure you've all had to lose some experiences, some things that you might have done in person, but now are online and they may not be as interactive as before. But it's good to hear that you're still able to, find the best in that experience. So that's really good. to hear, RJ. So, what would you say to someone like for those high schoolers who are either in grade 11 or in grade 12 deciding what program to what program to say yes to? What would you say to someone like vying to get into a finance or accounting program at Waterloo? Like it's a pretty prestigious program. So, what advice do you have for someone deciding if that field is for them or if the school is for them?
Yeah, I think just thinking back to my own like sort of grade 11, grade 12 application experience, I think the way that I approached figuring out whether finance or accounting was for me was, I think, as much as possible getting to take business electives that are available at your high school. I think unless you like have actually sort of studied out at least a couple different elements or like subjects that would potentially be transferred over to your undergrad, I think you never really know for sure if that's something that you click with. But something I've found at large is that maybe people that are more interested in business tend to be on the more extroverted side and they enjoy working in teams, whereas maybe with a science focus, there's more of an emphasis on the analysis and the more individual work, let's call it.
Mhm.
So I think just taking the subjects, I think another element is if there are different business clubs or programs, sort of like junior achievement, that are available in your high school or area at large. I personally would highly, highly recommend like getting involved with those because I think, like I mentioned, text the textbook is totally different from the real world, and I've always found that not only are the learnings far more valuable when it's applied, but also a lot of the people that I've met in like junior achievement when I was in high school, they're people that I'm still in contact with today. And even if they're at different universities, I still am definitely reaching out and asking them how has your experience been at like this business school across the province. And I think sort of that connection is really, really cool.
Yeah, a big part of business is networking. So I can see why you're saying get involved and really dip your toes into the waters of it and see whether it's for you. So that's definitely important
Mhm.
advice that I'm going to keep with me, and I hope our listeners do too. So switching gears a little bit, we had talked a bit about your entrepreneurial experience. So like you mentioned, not only are you a finance student, but you also have an interest for the business side of things. And you've also mentioned like incubator organizations like JA Canada that you've been part of. So what is you mentioned we touched a little bit about that before, but how your financial knowledge helped in your entrepreneurial experience, and maybe vice versa?
Hmm. Yeah, so I think something I would say that's at least pretty unique to Waterloo is Waterloo. I think it's sort of famous for being the Silicon Valley of the North, let's call it. And so like there's a lot of different technology startups within the Waterloo area that I actually had a chance to interact with and be sort of exposed to throughout my undergrad. And so in terms of like how financial knowledge touched that entrepreneurship piece is I've been involved with this club called the Student Venture Fund at Waterloo, and it's got about $1 million in assets, and we
Oh
invest
wow.
in yeah, we actually invest in Waterloo startups and Toronto startups, yeah, with a specific focus in technology. And I think the financial piece plays in because I think the valuable part about studying business as an undergrad is you get to enter the world with different frameworks and sort of skill sets that you can like utilize in different situations. And I think having that investor mindset with the venture fund and getting a chance to have evaluated so many different sort of promising companies, it's allowed me to realize, hey, what do investors actually look for when they're seeking to invest in a company? And the benefit to that is when you actually go and maybe potentially pursue a venture of your own, or want like you're looking to start your own company, you actually have a sense of what it is that investors look for and whether or not you actually want to receive things like angel funding or receive funding from like a venture capital firm. Just having that ability to recognize what are the different elements that I should be focusing on to build a really strong business, that's invaluable whether you're in the financial industry or you're seeking to pursue entrepreneurship.
Yeah, definitely. finance is like a huge part of entrepreneurship and business, and having that mixed background can really help you going forward. You can see how. So, like you mentioned, you've been part of like the junior achievement, small businesses, and you've been doing this investment thing and that Dragon's Den type internship you mentioned. So, what's been your most memorable entrepreneurial experience so far? What's that special moment that you're going to look back on years from now and think, oh, I remember this, and then laugh about it? What was your favorite experience?
Yeah, that's a good one. I think sort of like tying back to your own story, I just being in high school, I think my favorite experience would probably be it actually in my grade 12 year. I remember like I mentioned, super involved with JA throughout my high school, and something pretty cool that I got a chance to be invited to was what's called the Business Hall of Fame in Canada. And so I got an email from sort of the one of the heads of JA and the company program, and she was inviting me. Hey, RJ, we've really loved your involvement with the program so far, and we'd love to invite you down to downtown Toronto, sort of in the middle of the school week, and we want you to talk about your experiences with the JA program. I was like, okay, cool, yeah, I would love to
Wow.
do that. And and yeah, so I was like, okay, let me skip school one day and just go to downtown. And so I was going up the elevator to the sort of this uh, luncheon area, and as soon as I walk out, like the scenery, like I guess the setup of the banquet, let's call it, was
Hmm.
incredible. There was this entrance area where you had to be checked in, put your coat out, and you had to like give this ticket to enter the whole I guess the Business Hall of Fame. And when I went up to the reception, she was like, "Hey RJ, really pleased to meet you. Just wanted to let you know that you're going to be sitting across from Peter Mansbridge, who is like the anchor of CBC's, I think, what is it, the national, like the CEO of McDonald's Canada, and the like Ian Telfer. He's the sort of the namesake of Ottawa's what is it, Ottawa's Business School, which is the Telfer School." And so
Oh my gosh.
I was like, oh my, yeah, I was like,
Wow, that's an experience.
I know for sure, yeah. Like I did not even like I didn't have a tie. I was like, yo, I did not expect like this to happen. And so I was sitting across from like two absolutely like amazing bit like Canadian business people, and I think just having a chance to get that exposure so early on and meeting people who have sort of made it in the business field has been really fascinating for me. Like ending off on that piece, I think a really cool piece that I have from that whole memory is at the end of the ceremony, the CEO of McDonald's Canada, he actually sort of walked over to me and said hi, and he actually passed me his business card. And the cool thing about his business card is it's in the shape of a Big Mac, and he said, "RJ, depending on how you want to go about this, you can either like contact me if you ever have any questions, or you can use this Big Mac business card in any Canadian McDonald's and just redeem a Big Mac." So I think that was like pretty fun part of that whole experience.
Oh wow, that's really cool to meet so many people in the field that are just so, I guess, high up and they have so much knowledge and then be able to connect with them. I think that's a really valuable experience. So
Yeah.
tying this back to the current situation, um, you've obviously been heavily involved in like a lot of activities, whether it's part of your university, extracurriculars, or internships. So the COVID-19 pandemic, like we said, has stuck a wrench in a lot of our plans, and like you mentioned, some of yours as well. So how has the pandemic affected some of the um, like the learning aspects, the university and the internship parts of your educational and experience career?
I think the biggest element is probably just the relationships that you build. I think especially in a business undergrad, a big element of your undergrad experience isn't just actually the learning, but also like you mentioned earlier, the relationships and network that you build. I think a lot of the and you've probably experienced this yourself, but a lot of the like incidental interaction that you have throughout the day, like when you bump into friends, like when you're walking down the hall, or when you just like ask somebody if they caught what professor said, a lot of
Yeah.
those have sort of disappeared. And I think that's something that a lot of people are missing to some degree. But I think there's definitely an element of being intentional with the relationships that you do want to build, whether it's like with people in your program or just family and friends. And I think that's something that has been something beneficial to everybody, just that realization that if it's gonna happen, it's because I make it happen, sort of thing.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. There's a lot of things that you might have been talking to people on the way to school or on the bus or in between classes that now it's all completely gone. And if you want to get something done, you really have to go out of your way and talk to someone. So, but I think that's telling us a good thing about how the future of business might look like. So that's pretty interesting. Now, tying this back to previous questions about entrepreneurship, businesses have been heavily affected by the pandemic, especially small businesses. We always hear on the news that, oh, this restriction and that restriction, and these zones are changing, and the poor small business owners, they're not able to keep up with all the constant changes. I know hairdressers are always like, okay, when can I cut people's hair? When can't I? And it's affected
Yeah.
every single field. So obviously the great stock market crash of May 2020 will be remembered forever, but the economy has been
Yeah.
berated because of COVID. But from a financial standpoint, like what do you make of the last year? Obviously, lots of people, like the housing market has gone up, but everything else has kind of gone down. So in what ways, hidden or obvious, has the pandemic affected finances?
Right. So I think that's an interesting question. I think I could probably touch on it in a couple ways. I think from my like perspective in venture capital specifically, it's been pretty interesting because valuations specifically of technology companies have been sort of through the roof more recently because
Yep.
obviously technology companies they have uh, a moat, let's call it, that a lot of people or companies that are more physical in nature don't really get access to. So that could be one piece of it. But in terms of like a more personal day to day level, I think something that a lot of people will have to be more weary of when it comes to personal finances is like just spending on like discretionary things. I think there's been a lot of savings, I think, at a Canadian level across different households. And I think household savings are at an all-time high. And I think from a personal perspective, just being more aware of like where we spend our money and our time and making sure that we're careful if we ever like have to come through a situation like this again.
Yeah, I've heard that on the news as well. Like because people are not going on vacations anymore, shopping has become a lot less. I think we've saved like billions of dollars as a country in terms of personal savings. So, as parts of the
Mhm.
world, like for example, Australia or maybe China, have started to recover from the virus, they're now back to quote unquote normal. Many parts of the world are still struggling to deal with like new variants and mutations. So, we're at this place where half the world might soon be COVID free, and the other half is still desperately trying to stay afloat. So, while some parts of the world have vaccines, have the virus, and don't, what do you think the future will look like for international businesses for the next year or so?
Yeah, that's a that's a interesting one because I think something that I've been seeing increasingly with especially with friends who are working at other business type internships is at least within like sort of professional services in the financial industry, there's a bigger emphasis on creating I guess opportunities specifically for people to work from home and this increasing that ability for almost flexibility from an individual worker perspective. So that's been something interesting that I've noticed. But I think there's also an element of just looking at our businesses in the long term and just making sure that they're able to address risks and obstacles that are sort of unexpected, let's call it. And yeah, just building up organizational resilience for like things like the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, that's definitely that resilience piece is really important, especially going forward. We don't know what the future will hold. Hopefully, we don't have to see another pandemic on this scale, but we always have to stay strong for that. So, like you mentioned, like a lot of people are able to work from home now, or not even from home. People are working from the cottage or from another country simply because it's all online work. You don't have to actually go in person. So that's really changed what the culture of work has been like. And as always, like the pandemic has affected a lot of people's, like a lot of people have lost their jobs, but let's just end this off with a bit of hope. When we do recover, when everything does go back to normal, do you think that the world of all this people developing these habits of saving or working from home, do you think that will stick as the economy recovers along with us, or will the financial world post COVID look kind of like what it does now?
Mhm. I think we'll have to see, right? I think there's always the hope that like people will learn from the lessons that like the hard lessons, let's call it, that we're going through today. But there's always a chance that like once this is past us, we may forget it. But I do think I'm pretty positive and optimistic that a lot of a lot of the lessons were really hard learned this time around, and
Mm-hmm.
they'll sort of be built into us that like we have to be like sort of like the like I don't know, that motto that the Starks have, like winter is coming and always be prepared for whatever comes, sort of thing.
Yeah, that's definitely a good motto. Just one last question before we end off. This is a bit of a spontaneous question. So I read that you are the co-founder of Waterloo Business Review, and your website looks pretty amazing. All the articles that you and your team have written. So can you tell us a little bit about that? How did you get involved in that organization, and how's it been doing for the past little while?
Yeah, so that's I think always sort of always sort of been interested in like building communities and growing organizations. I think that sort of started in my first year. I was in this residence, sort of hanging out with another business student, a friend of mine, and we were like, hey, there aren't that many opportunities for students, at least at Waterloo, to like learn about the business environment, because there's a big learning curve when it comes to reading current news articles on things like The Economist. And we wanted to create a space where students can, like even from their first year at Waterloo, understand the whole story and context behind something, and really dive deep into a specific topic that they were interested in. And so we just said, hey, why don't we start something called Waterloo Business Review, and sort of explore that mandate and that mission. And so that's what we've done over the past 2 years. And I think we've done pretty well so far. We actually have readers from, I think, 14 different countries, sort of
Oh,
35
wow.
articles published. And yeah, we're doing great. I think the team, like I'm incredibly close with the team, like, and we've really loved the journey so far. So really enjoyed it.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. When I heard the name, I was reminded of Harvard Business Review, and I'm sure you guys must have taken some inspiration from other business reviews of universities. So, what I know about HBR is that they have like books published with all their articles and stuff. So, what are the future plans for Waterloo Business Review? Do you guys plan on continuing your articles, growing your online platform? What do you see for the future of this?
I think something we've launched more recently actually has been something called it's a column called Alumni Insights. And what we've been trying to push for within that column has really been an emphasis on building up the relationships between Waterloo alum the and the undergrad community there. Because I think, yeah, like we mentioned before, like having the ability to learn from other people's stories is so important, and learning about the different opportunities that are out there is something that we've been sort of emphasizing and sharing with our readers. And so I think we'd be really interested in sort of like Cure Talk, maybe potentially launching a podcast in addition to just publishing the interviews.
Oh, wow. So, we'll that then, and that's a really important thing, learning from the alumni that come before us. They have a lot of experience, especially in fields of technology and business. So I think that'll be a really interesting next step. So this was
Mhm.
great meeting with you, great talking with you, RJ. You gave us some really informative insight that I'll keep with me, and I'm sure our listeners will too. So thank you for your time, and thank you for your knowledge.
Thank you, Ria. Really enjoyed speaking with you, and yeah, hoping to keep in touch.
Yeah, and a big thank you goes out to our listeners for tuning into this episode of the Race to a Cure podcast, Cure Talk, where I, Ria, talked with Roberto Babaran Jr., a third-year honors bachelor's of accounting and financial management student at the University of Waterloo, about his studies, his experiences, and what the future of the financial world will look like post-COVID. Until next time, check out Race to a Cure's articles, studies, and informative posts on our website, and follow us on Instagram and Facebook. Thank you for joining, and we hope you stay tuned for the next one.